Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about collapsing publishers. This is something that if you have your game published by other people rather than self-publish it, you may very well run into. And I have quite a long history here, and I can tell you some examples. I'll start with my 1982 game Dragon Rage, which has since been reissued in 2011 in a somewhat different format. Dwarf Star was an offshoot of Heritage Models, run by Duke Seafried. And Heritage published microgames. They were $10 at the time, which is about $30 in modern money. Very small format, small box, half-inch counters, thin, small, thin cardboard board. And they did very well. I was told Dragon Rage had been printed 10,000 and that it was the bestseller. I don't know if that was true, but that's what I was told. Well, I never got a dime for that game because Duke got in a spitting match with his banker, as it was told to me, and the banker called in his loan, and the whole company collapsed, taking Dwarf Star with it. Then more recently, we have Clash of Arms, which was a war game publishing company, and they had my game Germania. But they were having difficulties because Germania really should have plastic pieces, and that's the way I'd always played it, and that's not something they'd ever done. But then times got tougher in wargaming and in gaming in general for publishers, and finally Clash of Arms just faded away. And to continue about Germania, I sold that to another company, but then they turned around later and said, well, it's too long and it won't appeal to Kickstarter, so we're going to kick it back to you. And that's an example where this contract was signed and everything, but publishers can do that. Then Mayfair. Mayfair, of course, one of the biggest publishers, and their big game was Catan. They accepted a abstract game of mine that's one of my best games and can be played by 2 to 4 players. They tried to figure out various themes to tack on, but after about 8 years or maybe 9 years, they spun Catan off as a separate company. They gave the games that they had in hand back to people. Fortunately, I'd got an advance in this case, quite a substantial advance. And not long after, they simply disappeared. Then a fairly recent example. For a while here in North Central Florida, we had a game designers guild, but we just don't have the population hereabouts to support it, so it's no longer active. But at the time, one of the people who wanted to be a designer, who came to the meetings, talked to me about an idea he had for a stock market game. And a couple times, we were the only people at the meeting until a couple hours had passed or an hour had passed. And he told me so much about this game, we discussed it so much, that I finally decided I'm going to design this game. It's a stock market game with the premise that oligarchs all over the world are manipulating the stock market, which, may be happening, who knows? But it was unique because the players then determined the change in stock prices, not some random event somewhere or other. In any case, the first time my collaborator took it to a convention to play test, he found a fairly new small company who wanted to publish it. And we ran with that for a year or two because we hadn't finished it. And that company then collapsed. In fact, according to what I've read on Board Game Geek, that company, Flying Lemur, ran a Kickstarter and never delivered and owes $50-some thousand to a lot of people. Another example, a video game, a small company contacted me wanting to do a electronic Britannia. Well, I was pretty sure that was beyond them. It was just a few guys. kind of doing this on the side. But I said, well, I have this Doomstar game, which is really good, and it is, and it should be relatively easy to program. And they decided to do that. And those kinds of games sell a lot to start with and then hardly anything at all. So after the first few months, I got $500. And although that's actually pretty good for a small video game, it probably hasn't sold much yet, although it still appears in bundles and so on. And I have not had another word from those guys, even though they owe me some money. They're still around, at least by name, Large Visible Machine. Then the latest example, the publishers of the new edition of Britannia and Dual Britannia got hit really hard by COVID and essentially stopped publishing board games or new board games. And while I got a very substantial advance from them, I've not seen a cent yet. And I know they still owe me money even from the Kickstarter, and that Kickstarter was in July of 2020. So they haven't collapsed because their original business was making and selling plastic models to miniatures wargamers. And they can still do that. They've sort of pulled back to that. But evidently, they've forgotten their obligations, and who knows how long that'll continue. So there may be other examples that I've forgotten, but there's quite a few over the course of me designing games, and it's something that's going to happen because tabletop game publishers are really quite small. Often they start out as self-publishers, but not always. Fantasy Flight started out as a self-publisher. You don't know what's going to happen, but small companies who are not the livelihood of the people involved, but are doing it as a hobby more or less, are just not likely to be terrifically stable. Thanks for listening.